Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 400 library systems across the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the amazing authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to be sitting here with New York Times bestselling author Madeline Miller. And I know that everybody is so excited to start hearing from Madeline about her life as a writer and her body of work. But before we begin, I need to pause and give you all that standard housekeeping information that keeps everything running smoothly. We have compiled some questions that were pre-submitted with registration, so thank you. But you can also continue to submit your questions during the talk by clicking that questions button that's just below the live stream video. Keep in mind, there are a lot of you tuning in this evening, so we will get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry, if you have to leave early for any reason whatsoever, all registrants will receive a link to the recording via email in about 24 hours. Now, to formally introduce our guest. Madeline Miller is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 2 novels, The Song of Achilles, which won the Orange Women's Prize for Fiction in 2012, and Circe, which was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2019. Her books have been translated into over 32 languages. Miller holds an MA in Classics from Brown University, studied in the dramaturgy department at Yale School of Drama, where she focused on the adaptation of classical texts to modern forms and taught Latin, Greek, and Shakespeare to high school students for over a decade. Welcome, Madeline. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is such a joy. Thanks to all of you out there tuning in. I want to really thank the Library Speakers Consortium for inviting me, and all the libraries out there that are making this happen. My mom was a librarian. I love libraries so much. They made me the writer I am. So I just always love doing things for libraries. And I just want to give a big thank you and send all my love out to all of you out there for the work you are doing for readers, for writers, for all of us.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's fantastic to hear that your mother was a librarian. We're a huge lover, of course, of libraries around here. So you found the right place. So one of the ways I like to start off with each talk, and one of the questions that we get most often, honestly, is about your journey as a writer. And Kaylee Marie from Lee County Library System specifically says, "We'd love to hear your journey to becoming an author. Can you please share?"
Sure. Well, I have to, since I've already brought my mom up, I have to talk about her a little bit more because she was right there from the very beginning. She was not just a librarian, she was many, many other things as well. That was sort of one of the steps along the way, but it was always one of the pieces that was closest to her heart. She loved reading, and she was an English major. And so she read to me so much when I was a child. And those are some of my happiest memories of being read to. And then when I was starting around kind of 5 and 6, she started to read me pieces of the Iliad and the Odyssey as bedtime stories. And I fell in love. I mean, I was just absolutely mesmerized by these stories. I'm sure she was editing them. She still thinks, later on, she told me she thought that was really inappropriate that she did that. But I loved it.
It worked out well.
Yes, it did. It did. So she was like, I was just surrounded by books and words growing up. She was always taking me to the library. The shelves were bursting with books. So I felt like I grew up saturated in this world of book loving and storytelling that I'm so grateful for. Mm-hmm. And then as I continued to sort of fall in love with myths, I sought them out myself. I ended up taking Latin as soon as I could. I had a wonderful Latin teacher who taught me ancient Greek. And so by the time I was heading off to college, I knew that I wanted to continue to study classics in a pretty serious way. So that was happening over here, but I was not thinking about writing about classics. Over here is where I wanted to be a writer. So I was sort of existing on these 2 parallel tracks, the part of me that wanted to be a classicist and read ancient Latin and Greek poetry, and the part of me over here that wanted to be a writer. And I had really wanted to be a writer very young, starting even in as early as kind of 2nd grade. Apparently, there's a legend that my 2nd grade teacher pulled my mama sighed and said, well, she's pretty weird, but as long as she can write, she'll probably be okay. And I was like, oh, thank you. My mom later revealed this to me, and I was like, she was totally right. I should find her and tell her.
That is weird to a second grader, though.
I am not sure. I would have. I wish I could ask her, what did you mean by weird? I just accepted. I was kind of a weird kid. I lived in my head a lot.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all wrong with that.
So I continue to sort of think about writing, but my models for writing were really contemporary authors. I was reading sort of all kinds of contemporary fiction starting in high school and through college. I loved Margaret Atwood. I loved Isabel Allende. I loved James Baldwin, Amy Tan. These were touchstones, Laurie Moore. These were writers that Jeanette Winterson, like these were writers I was reading and rereading and just, in the grip of. Mm-hmm. And then I, in college, began to try to write my first novel. It was terrible, but it was very important to write it and get it out and get it done with, kind of my, sludge novel, my Clearing the Pipes novel. And then my senior year of college, a friend asked me to co-direct a production of Troilus and Cressida. And Troilus and Cressida is Shakespeare's version of the Iliad. And it was really the first time that I had started interacting with these myths that I had loved since I was a child from a storytelling perspective, where I was getting to write about them, or I was getting to interact with them from this, kind of shaping them way. I was talking to the actor who was playing Achilles and talking about, how he was going to say his lines and how he was going to do the scene. I was talking to the actor playing Cassandra, and I was sort of getting to be part of it. And it was thrilling and addictive. Mm-hmm. And when that production was over, I suddenly had this lightning bolt that this very passionate master's thesis I was planning on writing about Achilles and Patroclus was actually a novel. So that's when kind of everything came together. And I realized that this long history of wanting to be a writer and this history of classics could actually merge, and I could do both at the same time.
So did you really start writing the Song of Achilles your senior year?
I did. I started this summer after my senior year. Everything, I didn't know what I was doing. And I felt like it was this terrible secret that I was keeping. I didn't tell any of my classics peers that I was working on it because I thought I was going to get arrested by the classics police. And this was a totally blasphemous thing that I was doing. So I kept it very secret. And I remember really struggling to figure out how I wanted to tell the story. I knew I wanted Patroclus to be my narrator, and I knew I wanted it to sort of come from his perspective. And I knew, of course, that it wanted, that it was going to be a love story, and that the love story was at the center of the story. But other than that, I had no idea how to do this. And so there was a lot of me flailing around and trying different voices and trying different entry points into the story. Did I want to start at the end and do flashback? So basically it took me 10 years from that summer to actually finish it. So the actual length of the Trojan War was caught on my computer screen.
Well, that kind of leads me then to process, especially from the Song of Achilles and then to Circe, and then even your short story, Galatea. Mary Claire from Yonkers Public Library is saying, obviously research plays a huge part in your writing process. Can you provide insight into what your process is? Maybe in particular, your writing process between your novels and your short story. Did you encounter any specific challenges with regard to even research or tone, background, organization? You said you were kind of flailing with the Song of Achilles for a little, but I imagine that got better with time and with each book.
Well, I flail just as much. It's just a new type of flailing. Really, what has changed, I think, for me is that I know that flailing is part of the process, and that, I just accept it, I have to sort of wander around and take every wrong path. But in terms of research, so I'm fortunate in that, I have this kind of solid background foundation of having a master's in classics. So a lot of, I have this kind of baseline of research. But when I'm approaching a new project, I go out and I read every single ancient version of the story that I can find. And even just like sort of references where the character is just referenced once or very quickly or some very small thing, I want to just absorb it all. And of course, I feel like I have to say that, even doing that, I know that I'm missing out on tons of versions of this from the ancient world because I'm only looking at what we have, what has survived. And whenever we're talking about what has survived from the ancient world, we're talking about just, a small fraction of what existed. So, but that is always kind of inspiring to me because it's like, well, this is what we have and I want to conquer what we have, but also there are all these gaps in this space that you can sort of breathe into. And we don't know what might have existed in those spaces. So I find what we have, both what we have and what we don't have, to be kind of equally inspiring.
Yeah.
And so I do a bunch of research beforehand and I let myself sort of see what germinates, see what starts to, speak to me. I think my biggest problem during Song of Achilles was that my academic side and my novelist side felt like they were arguing, like they were in conflict with each other. That my academic side was like, but you have to include every myth because I had researched it all for that master's thesis I was talking about. I ended up writing about something else. And giving myself permission to leave things out was really a huge deal. And so, for example, one of the scenes that I struggled the most with in Song of Achilles was where my novel finally caught up to the Iliad. And when I finally caught up to the Iliad, right, I got to that first famous scene of the Iliad, which is the big fight between Achilles and Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces. That's basically like a "you're not the boss of me" fight. And in that scene, the goddess Athena appears and she plays sort of a very significant small role where she grabs the back of Achilles' hair to stop him from killing Agamemnon. And I wrote draft after draft after draft of that scene. And I couldn't kind of get past it, just felt dead on the page. And finally I was like, I think I have to take Athena out. And like the thought of, I was literally like waiting for the thunderbolt to come. Like, how dare I cut Athena? But she didn't work there. She didn't work in the scene. And as soon as I cut her out of the scene, the whole thing flowed. And I was like, oh, that's what I needed to do. So I kind of justified it to myself. Like, well, maybe he realizes with his internal wisdom, Athena's the goddess of wisdom, that it would be not a great idea to just stab the leader of the Greek forces here. So I sort of found a reason for why it was okay that she wasn't there. But I sort of taught myself how to do that with Song of Achilles. And then by the time I got to Circe, I was good at it. And I was like, sure, I'm changing it. I'm leaving it out. No problem.
This is what I want. Well, I would imagine when it gets to an editor, then they have you cut even more, right?
My agent, Julie Baer, and my editor, Lee Boudreau, are both absolutely brilliant people. And I really count on, Julie's always my first reader, and I really count on her to let me know when I haven't explained the myth too much, when I haven't explained it enough, or if I've explained it too much. And so she's really good at saying, you're dropping this reference to this mythological character here. You need to explain who that is. So I really, really appreciate that feedback from her. But usually it's not so much about cutting. It's about making sure that it all kind of flows together and has a psychological arc that makes sense for the reader who may not know the backstory. So I rely on both of them. They're incredibly smart, truly brilliant readers. So I'm always very grateful for their feedback.
Wonderful. So you talked about, the sources that we have and the kind of the balance of also what we don't have. And Drew from East Baton Rouge Parish Library is saying, how do you weigh the various source materials in deciding which versions of the myth that we do have to include slash adapt for your own stories? Does Homer get more authority than other versions in your choice, for example?
That's a great question. Homer did, in Song of Achilles, that was my rule, because there were so many myths about Achilles that really it was impossible to include them all. So I weighted the Iliad much more heavily than everything else. I sort of looked there first, but I did end up changing some things from the Iliad, and then I kind of looked to other sources to fill in the gaps in the Iliad. But that I took that as my base. With Circe, I really did something different, because the Circe episode in the Odyssey is actually narrated by Odysseus himself to some people he's trying to impress.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Odysseus is the great liar of ancient literature. He is the politician, the spin master. And so I thought, well, I don't have to believe anything he's saying. So, I took the Odyssey with a big grain of salt, and I didn't make Homer that sort of, rock the same way I did for Circe, the way I made the Iliad the rock for the Song of Achilles.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I enjoyed arguing with Odysseus.
So Drew has a follow-up question, saying many elementary and middle school children are introduced to the Greek myths through adaptations like the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. How valuable are these, in your opinion, in educating the next generation on the Greek classics?
I mean, I love seeing students dive into adaptations. And I think adaptations oftentimes lead to going back to the original. I love that we have some truly amazing, incandescent translations. Emily Wilson's translations, I think, are absolutely stellar. And the audiobooks for both of her translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey are amazing. And so, I love that there is just this wealth of adaptations of great translators out there that are just so exciting. So, I had many Latin students come to take Latin because they had loved Percy Jackson. So I think anytime we're sort of opening the conversation and saying, let's talk about mythology, let's talk about how there are different ways to do it, and let's talk about how different generations have imagined it in different ways, and how's another way you could tell this story, and what's another way you could tell this story, and what about if we shift to perspective? I mean, I think all that is so useful. And whenever I'm teaching a myth in class, I'm always sort of saying, well, whose story is being told, and who's getting to tell the story, and whose story here is being left out. And so I think that, the more the merrier. I love that adaptations are having such a wonderful moment and capturing the minds of so many readers.
I agree. Like the adaptations and then the modern retellings kind of, they connect these new generations back to the classics and make you want to go back and read them. Although after reading your books, I don't know that I'll enjoy the Iliad and the Odyssey quite as much. Thanks for that. I'll just reread yours. It'll be fine.
That's a huge honor. But really, the audiobooks of the new Emily Wilson's are wonderful.
I'll have to check those out. I haven't heard of those. So Katie from New Orleans Public Library is saying, I love your books, not only how they expound and bring mythology to life, but how you so beautifully capture the inner lives of the characters. I'd love for you to speak to how you get clear on the inner workings of the characters without being too tied to what history has already told us about them. I know you said already that you struggled a little bit with that, but would you like to expand on Katie's question?
Absolutely. And thank you so much. I feel like I owe a lot of it to theater and to a lot of psychology courses that I also took, but mostly to theater. After directing that production of Troilus and Cressida, I ended up falling in love with Shakespeare and starting a Shakespeare program and doing a ton of directing and really sort of losing myself in directing and Shakespeare. And so much of what I know about sort of building a psychological arc, about characterization, really came from that One of the biggest problems with my early writing was that I was terrified of writing dialogue. I mean, truly terrified. My first horrendous draft of the Song of Achilles had almost no dialogue in it. And I love reading dialogue, but I was just sort of scared. I didn't know how to do it. And, directing plays completely cured me of that. I was like, oh, dialogue is the best. And it's so interesting and it can do so much. So I feel like I brought in, whenever we're talking about the ancient myths, we're usually not getting the internal monologue of the characters. I think that a lot of internal psychology is implied in what happens, but we're not really getting like the Hamlet soliloquy. But here I was also steeped in, Shakespeare soliloquies and other theater as well that was very, very psychologically deep and, really had that sort of internal action brought to life. And so I wanted to bring that into the myths. I wanted to say, okay, here are the 5 things the character does. So how does that make sense? How do I thread that needle so that that makes sense for that character? Mm-hmm. And there were absolutely things that I left out. For example, in Circe, there is a myth from Ovid where Circe turns this guy into a woodpecker. I just wasn't interested and it didn't sort of fit with the psychological arc I was telling. But I'm always looking for motivation. I mean, I love to know that as a person. Why do people do what they do? And I'm always asking that question of sort of like, how can I get more into this character's mind? Mm-hmm. And not just my narrator, but all the characters around them. And so, I love secondary characters. I love tertiary characters. I always want to know why they're doing what they're doing. Characters like Pasiphae, characters like Thetis, Achilles' mother. Those are characters that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working with. And of course, what I know as the writer is not always what Patroclus or Circe knows as the narrator. But it's fun to sort of bring in that psychology for all the characters as well.
Yeah. So would you say then that directing stage productions and making your dialogue better, is that how you kind of landed on first person? Karina from Troy Public Library, this is prophetic, I had to put it in there. How did you land on writing in first person for both of your novels? And it sounds like kind of stage production gave you that a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think also contemporary fiction. I mean, I love a first person narrator. I love what you can do with a first person narrator, how deep you can go inside them, how close you are to their lived experience. And I think sometimes the myths can feel kind of distanced. They can feel like they're, is this really relevant? It can feel very far away. And I wanted to bring the reader right into the story, and I wanted to be right in the story. And so first person just felt, like that was what I wanted from the beginning. But you're absolutely right that sort of theater ties into that, because in a way, I think of the novels as one person shows, right? They're telling the monologue, they're delivering the monologue of their life.
Mm-hmm. Christine says, one of the many reasons I love your novels is your development of female characters. They are fully developed characters portrayed as strong, intelligent, and often resilient in the face of formidable challenges. As a female reader, I find such characters realistic, admirable, and relatable, but not particularly prevalent, in a lot of the fiction I read. Do you intentionally develop your female characters from what one might say is a feminist perspective, or does this come naturally to you?
I'm definitely a feminist. My mom was a feminist. She raised me to be a feminist. I think I totally agree. We should all be feminists, because what that means is that we're treating everyone as equally complex and treating everyone's story as equally worthy of being told. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I absolutely set out to, particularly with Circe, to take a woman's story and set it at the center of an epic. And women's stories were often traditionally not seen as important enough to headline an epic. And when we think about sort of the 2 big epic heroes, or, the 3, if you want to include Aeneas, Achilles and Odysseus, from the ancient Greco-Roman world, you're thinking about sort of characters who are very flawed, and who make a lot of mistakes and cause a lot of destruction. I mean, Odysseus's name comes from the verb meaning to be hated. Achilles' name possibly comes from the grief to the people, right? So these are characters who like kind of, there's a lot of havoc in their wake as they go. And I wanted to give Circe that kind of scope. I wanted her to make mistakes, and I wanted her to wrestle with big problems, and I wanted her to have to face gods and monsters, but to keep the focus also on her. And at the same time, as I was sort of giving her the scope that traditional male epic heroes have had for millennia, I also wanted to take some things that in the ancient world were considered very traditionally female and give them the epic treatment. So things like child rearing and childbirth and gardening and crafts, and really set those, kind of make those really significant in the story of this woman in an epic world. But as you say, I love all of the characters. And so I wanted very much to dive into, characters like Penelope. I mean, I wrote the entire novel of Circe knowing that Penelope was waiting for me in the last quarter, and I was so excited. I couldn't wait to get to her and to get to the conversations between her and Circe. Those were some of my favorite scenes to write, is sort of finally getting to have these two women talk to each other. And so I'm always very deliberately wanting to, give women their full complexity, their right to make mistakes, their right to wrestle with their lives, their right to sort of contradict themselves and grow and struggle, and to be heroic, and also to be unheroic at times. That all of that, all the messiness of life, I want women to be able to have in my stories.
I love it. And it makes me kind of think of what you said, even with, waiting for the classics police to come get you for like going outside of the true mythology. And even Louis is saying, it seems many of the popular modern retellings of Greek myth we are seeing right now are either about women, written by women, or have largely women readers. As a writer, have you faced sexist critique or reception for your books? Have people made assumptions about why you write, whether you know your stuff, or asserted that you've cheapened the myths by giving them retellings? Have you run into any of that, especially maybe even in academic circles?
I have run into it here and there, but actually refreshingly little, which I really appreciate, and very rarely in academic circles, because I think the truth is that classicists know that these stories live because they're retold, and that there is no definitive version of any of these myths. We can talk about Homer's version and Virgil's version and Ovid's version, and then we can talk about Chaucer's version and Shakespeare's version and Margaret Atwood's version and Derek Walcott's version and Terry Jones's version. And we can kind of go all the way down, and that I actually, although I felt like I was doing something blasphemous, I wasn't doing something new at all. I was doing something very, very old. That these stories had been, interpreted so many different ways through so many different lenses. So I think classicists, for the most part, get that.
Yeah.
And which I appreciate. And maybe the ones who, there may be tons of classicists out there, hating on my novels, but they're not telling me. So thank you for that.
Thank you for keeping it to yourself. Yeah. I even think of Galatea, the story of Pygmalion, right? And Shaw, the playwright.
Yes.
That's what comes to mind for me, even in that. They've just been retold over and over and over. You're completely right.
Well, and Galatea was something where, unlike my other, Song of Achilles and Circe, I really was reacting to almost entirely one text.
Well, can you say really quickly what Galatea is, what Pygmalion and Galatea is about?
Sure. So this is a famous myth rooted in Ovid, where the sculptor this brilliant sculptor creates a statue of a woman because he doesn't like regular women. And so he decides to create the perfect woman out of, in the story, it's ivory. In some versions, it's stone. I make it stone in mine, but in the original, it's ivory. And then he falls in love with her, and he prays for her to come to life, and she does. And, the myth sort of ends as she comes to life, and he's in love with her and she's in love with him. And, presumably they live happily ever after. I have always found that myth completely horrifying and disturbing, particularly because it's so rooted to the fact that he hates real women, and that's his motivation for creating this woman. I felt like, and I had taught the myth many, many times to high school students. And every time I taught it, I would get angrier. So finally
today
burst out in this short story.
Okay, so I want to kind of transition to some questions about the Song of Achilles and Circe, because we have a lot of really good questions. I guess let's start with, I know that you talked a little bit about the Song of Achilles being a love story told from Patroclus's perspective, but can you give just a very quick summary for people who may have not read the book yet?
Absolutely. So it's the story of the Greek hero Achilles, who's the best warrior. And when he's young, he's given a choice of having a long and happy life, but no one will ever know his name, or dying young and being famous forever. And he chooses to die young and be famous forever. So he goes off to the Trojan War, knowing that he's not going to come home. Now, his closest companion, his most beloved companion, is this young man, Patroclus, who was exiled from he was a prince, but he was exiled from his home for accidentally killing another child, and is taken in by Achilles, and the two are raised together. And he plays a very significant role in the Iliad, which is kind of a huge spoiler for the novel, but also it's 3,000 years old, so I won't get into too much of it. But he is Achilles stops fighting for the Greeks because he's furious at Agamemnon, the head of the Greek forces, and the Greeks start losing. And Patroclus puts on Achilles' armor and goes out to try to save the Greeks, and also kind of save his friend from himself, his lover, his friend. And so as I was dealing with that myth, I actually was kind of doing the opposite of what I mentioned I was doing with Circe. With Circe, I felt like I was taking this woman's life and putting it at the center of an epic and giving it its epic treatment. With Song of Achilles, I wanted to take a story that had traditionally been epic and really make it extremely intimate and lyric and focused on the love story, focused on the relationship between the two men at the center. And what really inspired me was the moment in, again, spoilers, I'm sorry, in the Iliad when Patroclus is killed. And Achilles reacts to losing him as if a bomb has detonated in his life. He is overwhelmed with grief and rage. And the Iliad starts with the line, "Sing, goddess of the destructive rage of Achilles." And, some of that rage is directed at Agamemnon. Achilles spends a lot of the Iliad being angry, but the real anger comes when he loses Patroclus, that real emotional response. And I kept getting caught on that as I was studying the Iliad, because I thought, well, we barely see Patroclus up to this point. Who is this man? And why does he mean so much to Achilles? Why does he overturn the entire plot of the Iliad when we barely see him? He's kind of always there with Achilles in the Iliad. He's the most beloved companion. But I felt like Homer was showing us the end of their story. And I wanted to imagine what was the beginning that led up to this utter soul devastation that happens to Achilles at that moment. So that was that was kind of the inspiration is I set that moment in the Iliad on my horizon and I wrote towards it.
Beautifully wrote towards it. So Donnie from LA County Library is saying, your books changed my life. As a gay man, I felt deeply seen and validated by the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. Portrayed in the Song of Achilles. How were you able to capture the tenderness, intimacy, and struggles of a specifically queer male-male relationship when, I'm assuming, Donnie says, you are not a queer man. I'm fascinated and forever grateful that you brought their relationship to life, but I'm curious what inspirations you drew from to depict them so accurately to mine and probably others' lived experience.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored by that comment. I do identify as queer, so I'm not a man, but I was very fortunate to have a queer bookstore near my house when I was in high school. And I stopped in every day on my way home from school. And I spent a lot of money there. It's a wonderful, wonderful bookstore called Giovanni's Room in Philadelphia. And I think it's still around. And I read so much queer memoir. I absolutely loved it. I just devoured it. And I didn't ever think about how that would go in. You know, I was reading it because I loved it and I felt really fed by it and so drawn into it. And then as I was writing Song of Achilles, I also sort of tried to put all that out of my mind at the same time, because I thought, you know, all I can speak to is these two men. I can become an expert in these two men. And so that's what I tried to do, is I tried to, you know, yes, I had this background, but I wasn't trying to imitate that or pull from it. Although, of course, I'm sure I did, you know, in a sense, like it was all there. It was bedrock for me. But I also really wanted to just tell the story of these two people. I felt like as a writer, I could become an expert on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. Stephanie from Library of the Chatham says, if you could explore one aspect of Achilles and Patroclus' relationship further, whether it's a scene, a character trait, or a theme, what would it be and why?
Oh, what a tempting question. I think that I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to that, because I feel like when I finished Song of Achilles, I really grieved for like a good week. I felt like I've written the last scene for them that I'm going to write. I loved getting to briefly reference them in Circe. And I loved thinking about them in how they appear in the Odyssey, when we see them very briefly in the Odyssey as well. So that scene in the Odyssey, so in the Odyssey, Odysseus has to consult this dead prophet. So Circe helps him go and do this whole ritual to call the dead out of the underworld, and there's a pit of blood, and they have to drink from the pit of blood. And as he's sort of is summoning the spirits out to talk to this dead prophet, he sees Achilles and Patroclus there. And he talks to Achilles, and they have this conversation where he basically says, oh, here you are, Achilles. You know, you're king of the dead. You have everything you ever wanted. You wanted to be famous, and you are. And in that scene in the Odyssey, Achilles basically undoes the entire Iliad. He says, I made the wrong choice.
Oh, wow. It's
better to be alive and to be nothing than to be king of the dead. And it's such a like gut punch when it happens. And it's so I guess that scene, although I didn't write it, is always hovering in my mind.
Okay. Julia from Falmouth Public Library says, I reread the Song of Achilles each year in January to start off my reading for the year and annotate different themes, symbols, and devices. One year was attempting to highlight all the use of simile, and I still find ones that I missed. I was wondering if you could speak about Patroclus's mother's lyre. It is one of my favorite symbols in the book. How did the idea for it come about? As a symbol, it can be interpreted many ways, but was there an interpretation you intended, or one people don't seem to catch?
Thank you. It's an honor to be read so thoughtfully. I felt like Patroclus's mother was so important to the story. And there's so many missing mothers in literature, and especially because Achilles' mother is so present in his story, but there's really nothing about her. So I had a blank slate mythologically to invent as I wanted to invent. And I sort of felt like somehow that there was this grief there for Patroclus, that there was this longing for connection with her that was never able to be completed, but not because she rejected him, but it was just never able to be completed. And that was all instinctive. That's sort of how it came out. And I've learned to trust that when it comes. And the lyre kind of just came into the story. And sometimes things come into the story and I have an impulse and I put it in, and later on I look at it and I think, no thanks, and I take it out. But that just kind of kept staying, and another scene would happen, and then the lyre would just sort of like appear there, and then it would appear again, and then it would appear again. And music is such a significant part of Achilles' story. One of the things I find so interesting about Achilles, well, there's a lot of things, one of which is how incredibly young he is when all this is happening. But another piece is that he has all these other aspects to him that are not murderous at all, that he is an incredible musician. And we see him as a musician in the Iliad. There's a beautiful scene of him playing and singing. And he's also a doctor. He's this amazing healer. And so it's almost like in another version of his story, he would have been Orpheus, or in another version of his story, he might have been Asclepius. He might have had this sort of other path as a musician or a creator or as a healer. And instead he got kind of shunted into this, murderer. And he chose to embrace that. Also, he chose to be a fighter, and he kind of fights against it. And then in the end, he, ends up fully embracing it. But it's that was so interesting to me. And so I felt like the lyre was kind of tugging on that tension in who Achilles was. And Patroclus is always trying to call Achilles towards his humanity. And so that felt like a piece of that as well. The music, the lyre, Patroclus's mother, Achilles' humanity, it all sort of mixed together. So thank you for seeing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of also noticed that every time the lyre was kind of coming up, it was also this shining beacon on Patroclus's caregiving. Mm. And so like his mother's lyre, and then him taking care of something, and even pulling Achilles back to his own humanity. I found this symbolism to be beautiful. Okay, so Taylor is from Calgary Public Library saying, Circe and Patroclus grow so strong and really come into their own in their respective books. I have always admired that about both of them. Was this evolution always what you had planned for them since planning the books, or did their resilience come naturally during the writing process?
It definitely came as I wrote. I mean, I try to allow myself to be surprised by my characters. And there are certain touchstones that I know going into it. So I knew, for example, when I was thinking about Patroclus, I love the fact that he is also a healer. And I love the fact that he had this sort of tragic backstory. And I love how incredibly loyal and, ethical he seems. He also has some interesting descriptions of him in the Iliad. Achilles is not the only one who mourns over Patroclus's death. Other people also sort of reference him, and they describe him as kind and gentle, always gentle. And those were really interesting descriptors for me. And they were ones that kind of kept coming up, because that's not a typical description for ancient Greek heroes. I mean, it's like, he sacked a lot of cities, he had good parties, he gave away good stuff. Like, it's not, he was always gentle. And so that was in my mind. But one of the things that surprised me about Patroclus was how impulsive he often was, and how passionate he often was, that even though he was kind of shy and insecure and didn't always know, then he would do these absolutely outrageously bold things from, so I loved that part of his personality, and it would just kind of happen as I was writing the scene. I was like, well, what's he going to do? Oh my gosh, he's going to do that.
Yeah.
So I loved following that impulse. It's kind of like, again, to bring in my directing, it's like when an actor has an impulse, it's wonderful to see like where those moments of inspiration come from. It definitely makes me understand what the Greeks were talking about with the muses coming in and inspiring you, those bolts of, I think this should happen. But I always found him a very strong character, because I think what you see is that when he's gone, Achilles is utterly not just bereft, but like rudderless. That that he is holding Achilles together in a way that you really only see when he's gone, and that there is a real kind of quiet strength there, and passionate, determined strength. And so in both novels, I'm really interested in the idea of sort of what makes a hero and what are heroic traits. And sort of the traditional heroic traits are, when we look at heroism in Achilles and Odysseus, they're these very kind of big, splashy personalities. But I was much more interested in the heroism of, who's the person who is kind of holding it all together. And similarly in Circe, looking at characters like Penelope, who is holding things together while her husband is away for 20 years. There's a lot of strength there in being responsible, in, being the person who is just day after day showing up, not fighting monsters, but, being there and creating order and trying to create goodness in the world. So in both cases, I see that as very strong, that sort of day-to-day trying to transform the world in a better way.
Yeah. In many ways, Circe runs along similar parallels to the Odyssey. It's like the Odyssey is the story of, an exhausted kind of war veteran, desperate to get home, and struggling to re-enter his life after so long. And then Circe goes on her own Odyssey, but in reverse. So like trying to exit her life and make one of her own, kind of away from this abusive family that she was born into, right? So one of the things about Greek mythology that's both surprising and intriguing is like how awful the gods really are. But the story you tell of Circe, a goddess, sounds like a very human story. So can you speak on these dynamics a little bit?
Sure. So there's a description of Circe from the Odyssey that really drew me in to her character and really gave me kind of the germ of the entire novel, which is Homer describes her as speaking like a human. And it's a little bit of a mysterious description, and scholars have kind of debated what exactly it means. But as a novelist, that immediately began germinating for me. I thought, well, what does it mean to speak like a human versus speaking like a god? Well, what does it mean to speak like a god? And in the ancient world, when the gods speak, it's like, this is huge, epic voices that shake the world. And if you're a human listening to a god speak to you, usually what happens in the literature is you fall to your knees, you feel completely boneless, the blood drains out of your body, your hair stands on end. It's like this overwhelming physical experience. And I thought, okay, well, if that's what it's like to speak like a god, and Circe speaks like a human, well, what would that mean for her growing up in the world of the gods? Well, it would probably make her an outcast, because the gods are obsessed with power. Let's face it, the gods are basically sociopathic narcissists in the myth. They only care about themselves and what they want. And so thinking about sort of how Circe would be caught between worlds, between the world of the gods where she was born, but this piece of her that somehow yearns for or belongs to the world of humanity. So already I'm kind of looking at this character who's straddling worlds and doesn't really feel fully at home in the world of the gods. And then I sort of began to think about how so often in Greek mythology, the most helpful characters are actually not the big gods, who are just as likely to blow things up and cause huge problems and have temper tantrums. And, if you're their favorite, they might help you out, or they might not if they just don't feel like it, or if they get distracted, or if, you're all of that. Like, it can just, it's not necessarily a good thing. And if you're one god's favorite, that means another god hates you. And so that's terrible. So, drawing the attention of the big gods in the mythology is usually quite bad. But the gods that are the most helpful are really the lesser gods, particularly the nymphs, that they oftentimes show up and they actually are quite helpful. So that was interesting to me too, this idea that the most powerful have the least empathy. And the goddesses who are the closest to humans are usually the ones who are helping the heroes out and who have the most empathy. And so I was thinking a lot about sort of her ability to speak like a human, resonating with this ability to feel empathy, ability to connect with humans, and desire to help and connect with humans, and not just be, a sociopathic narcissist like the rest of her family.
It makes me think of like the psychology of mere mortals, right? Is when we gain power ourselves, does our empathy start to just automatically plummet and decline?
It does.
Where we get.
Absolutely. And studies have shown that. Study after study has shown that that the more power and sort of lack of consequences that humans have, the more we act like tantruming Greek gods, the more we think like, well, here we are, and I must be up here because I'm special, and you must be down there because you're not special. So whatever I do to you is just fine.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
Yeah. And actually, what's interesting is that it is possible to fight against that by remembering times that you were powerless. That's the best way to sort of reverse that psychological effect in humans, is to remember times when you yourself needed help.
Mm-hmm. It's a good thing to remember if ever I gain any power.
I'm not I don't think we're in danger of that, but.
So Sarah from Pioneer Library System says, one of the things I loved about Circe was the sensory imagery that seemed so connected to the Homeric similes in the Odyssey. How were you able to write so evocatively about the smells, textures, feelings of things from this ancient world?
I love Homeric similes. I love similes from the ancient world in general. And so I definitely did a deep dive into those and wanted to sort of really try to absorb those. But also I want to give thanks to the time I spent in Greece, that was incredibly important, because nothing can really quite, nothing you read can really quite give you like exactly the way the light looks on the water, or exactly the way the dust feels, or the smell of, a particular grove, all of that stuff, all that sensory stuff. So I'm incredibly grateful for the time I've spent in Greece, because I feel like that was a significant piece of it. And then the third piece of that came again from my mom, who was an incredible gardener, and who took me to probably every botanical garden in every city we ever visited. And so I spent a lot of time among plants, and particularly I would always seek out the physic garden, the medicinal gardens. And so I have a lot of, again, sort of in my background, I have a lot of that plant stuff. I am not a master gardener at all. I was, but I feel like I kind of passively absorbed a lot of gardening stuff over the years.
Mm-hmm. So Vic wants to know, what other myths would you want to write or retell? Will you stick to lesser known myths? But we definitely had quite a few questions on rumors about your next book, and is the project Persephone still in the works, etc.?
Persephone is still in the works. I am writing very slowly. I'm in my flailing phase, as discussed, but there are so many myths out there that I'm interested in, and some of them, I have a short story based on Pandora that I'm sort of toying with. I'm not sure it's right. I'm not sure I'll ever finish it, but I think it was important for me to work on it. There is a nymph who shows up in the Aeneid, Juturna. I would love to write about her at some point. Persephone, as I said. Persephone is what's right in front of me, and her story is so interesting. And for a long time, I was sort of afraid to touch Persephone. And actually, Persephone, I mean, oftentimes that myth is the first one that we encounter. Because it's the myth of the seasons. And so it's wonderful. You know, you sort of tell the story to, I think the first time I read it, I was like 4, and it was in a children's book, which is so interesting to me because it's quite a disturbing and scary myth about sort of the limits of a parent's power. And I mean, there's, you know, sexual assault. And I mean, there's all kinds of like very, very disturbing things in the story. And for a long time, I felt like, well, I love the myth and it's so interesting, and there's a million different ways to look at it, but I really didn't know my way into it. I didn't sort of feel like I had a way in. I thought, well, there's that wonderful story that I'm interested in, but it's not for me. And then all of a sudden sort of something connected in my brain, and I was like, oh, I think there might be a small piece of this that might be for me. Yeah. So we'll see. We'll see if I make it through the flailing.
You'll make it through the flailing. You've done it before. We also have a lot of people asking about TV or film adaptations. I know at one point there was something in the works for Circe. Is that still happening? Is there anything new?
That is on hold for right now, although it's definitely something I would revisit down the line. The thing that I'm most excited about, although I really can't say very much about it at all, is a possible stage production of Song of Achilles. And I mean, live theater is so intimate, and I feel like feels just so right for Song of Achilles as sort of a next step for it. So I hopefully will have something more definitive to say about that soon, but I'm very excited about the stage production.
And would you be the director?
I would not. I feel like I need to turn it over to someone who has more experience than I do because I almost feel like I'm too close to it. I would like to be involved. I'd like to, you know, get to sort of stick my oar in, probably really annoyingly, from time to time. But I feel like that part of the transformation that has to happen when you're adapting something is that you really have to kind of let it go. And I think someone else could better help that transformation happen.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that for sure. Hannah would like to know, what is your favorite Greek myth or your favorite mythological character?
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, I guess I have to set aside, I mean, obviously Circe and Patroclus, because I spent 10 years and 7 years writing about them. So I have to love them. I feel great kinship with Cassandra. I've always loved and hated the story of Cassandra. It's so brutal. And I think it's also so resonant, the story of, you know, the woman who is desperately trying to tell the truth and no one will listen to her. I think that the story of I've always also loved the story of Arachne. Again, an extremely unjust story. The mortal who was turned into a spider by Athena for not being respectful enough. So those are myths that are always kind of with me. But I hate to say that they're my favorite because they're so depressing. So I'm going to say one that's not depressing. I love the tragedy, the Philoctetes, which, even though it's a Greek tragedy, actually has a happy ending. So that was one of my favorites. It has 3 main characters: Philoctetes, who was an elderly companion of Heracles. And when the Trojan War starts, and when Heracles died, he inherited Heracles's bow. He goes off to join the Trojan War, and he sails in a boat with Odysseus to get there. And they stop off on this island, and he gets bitten. Depending on the version of the story, there are various ways that this happens, but he gets bitten by a magical water viper, and his wound festers. And Odysseus is like, I'm not putting a festering wound back on my ship, bye. And he leaves him while he's sleeping. So the entire 10 years of Troy Philoctetes and his like festering wound are stuck alone on the island, and Odysseus is, off fighting the Trojan War. And then it turns out that Troy can't fall unless Philoctetes and his bow fights for the Greek side again. And everyone's like, Odysseus, you're gonna have to go get him. Odysseus is like, oh, I think he's gonna be mad at me. So he takes Achilles' son with him. Now, this is a nice version of Achilles' son. I do the nasty version in Song of Achilles. But this is the nice version of Pyrrhus Neoptolemus. And they go back to get Philoctetes. And I won't spoil it. It's definitely worth reading. But in the end, his wound is healed. And he does indeed go back and help them win the war by killing Paris, actually.
So we have hit the top of the hour. The last question that I always love to close with is, and Andrew worded it perfectly, Andrew from Mock Community College Library, is what are some of the must-reads shelved in your own library under historical fiction / Greek mythology, or what do you think that we should all run out to the library and check out immediately?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I just read for the first time Howard's End. I am obsessed. I love it so much. I realize that has nothing to do with Greek mythology or
That's okay.
retellings at all, but it just absolutely blew my mind. I mean, I love E.M. Forster, but I'd never read Howard's End, and I picked it up and I just absolutely loved it. I really love Geraldine Brooks' March. Mm-hmm. That was a wonderful retelling. That's her retelling of Little Women from the perspective of Mr. March as he's off in the Civil War. I am not generally a John Updike fan, but I really appreciate Gertrude and Claudius as a literary retelling. It's like a prequel to Hamlet. I really appreciate his commitment to how much he hates Hamlet. And so I think that's a very, very interesting novel in terms of conversation with the source material. I adore Home Fire by Kamla Shamsi, which is a retelling of Antigone. It's a play, but Hurricane Diane by Madeline George is a retelling of the Bacchae. Awesome, funny. I'm sure I'm blanking on like 10 million more. I mentioned Tayari Jones. An American Marriage is an amazing novel that actually the first time I read it, I completely missed this, but it's loosely inspired by the Odyssey. And so I loved then being like, oh my gosh, of course it is. So anyway, that's my starter. I'm sure I've left out many that I will feel.
That's okay. That's an amazing list. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I've had so much fun talking to you. So thank you for spending the last hour with us.
Oh my gosh, this was so much my pleasure. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for being so gracious and lovely. And thank you to libraries and librarians out there. You rock.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into our author talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we do thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video in the Rate This Program tab, you can find a link to the resources area, which contains a link to Madeline's books. We look forward to seeing you all again on April 2nd when we host Smithsonian curator Paula J. Johnson as she explores a sweeping history of food and culture. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us.